Hello, Dr. Jimmy again, and it's the same day I made part 8 and part 9. This is, of course, so I'm wearing the same Bill and Ted t-shirt from 2011. Good, because we're talking about 2011. This is part 10, my 10th video in my History of Halloween Horror Nights 21. In the previous video, I had started in on The Forsaken, but I hadn't gotten much further than just setting it up. So let's continue. The Forsaken, as I said, was set in this magnificent Spanish fort being attacked by these dead seamen, these dead sailors who had been part of Columbus's original expedition, but had been abandoned at sea, and out of revenge they're coming back to a Spanish fort a couple centuries later in the Caribbean, or possibly even on the Florida coast. And so there was something else they evoked in this house, though. There was something else which was a direct inspiration for this house. Strangely enough, 1981, I think, or 1980, John Carpenter film The Fog, the original one, not the reboot remake they made a few years ago with the kid who used to be Superman, or the Clark Kent in Smallville. Not that one, no, that one's crap. It's the original Fog with Adrienne Barbeau, of course. Always looking hot back in the 70s and early 80s. Adrienne Barbeau, and also, I think that Janet Leigh, who was in it, and her daughter, Jamie Lee Curtis, had a very small bit. She was in Halloween, Carpenter's earlier one. A good movie, though, rather creepy, very different from Carpenter's previous Halloween movie. This one was set in a little California town of Bodega Bay, and it turns out there's some history, because years before there had been a ship, an old mast, old-fashioned sailing vessel, and it was filled with lepers, not leopards. Leopards, big cats, rawr. No, lepers, people with leprosy. Not as scary as cats, but they're scary in another way because their skin's falling off and shit, because they have leprosy and they're very infectious, and they can give you leprosy, and then you'll have to be sent to Molokai or someplace. But that's what was coming on the ship, and they didn't want those lepers landing on the town of Bodega Bay, so they sank the vessel, and all those poor leprous sailors drowned. Now, a couple hundred years later, a curse came on the city of Bodega Bay, and these lepers came back in a terrible, sinister fog. In the scary fog banks would move through the city, and out of it came those sailors, killing the descendants of the people who had abandoned them, marooned them on the ship that sank. A certain number of people had to die, specifically ending in the old church, where the gold had been made into a cross, and was, the gold, the treasure that was stolen. And the old priest, of course, is the last one to get whacked at the... Oh, spoiled movie, sorry about that. Yeah, they thought they'd finished him off, but no, it came back, lopped the head off. But that's... But it was really creepy in the church, especially in that church, in the chapel, and the fog was there, and the sailors with their glowing eyes emerging out of the fog, hideous and decayed. And that's what helped to inspire this house, even though it's not set in California, has nothing to do with leprosy or anything like that. It's a different ship, different ocean, different part of the world, different time in history, but also coming back after a couple hundred years to seek vengeance on those who had betrayed them. Or perhaps their descendants, whether literal descendants or just descendants from that country. At any rate, they arrived there, and so that was part of it. And there's at least one scene in the house that looked exactly like a scene in the movie. So the fog was clearly an inspiration. But it was a magnificent house. Interestingly, there's no facade on the outside at all, but when you go in, there wasn't really the facade setup. It was like they put the facade in the middle of the house. I'll get to that later. First you enter, it's just like going to Pirates of the Caribbean. You're in the old Spanish fort, in the dungeons, going through these things, and there's cells around you, and you can see like the soldier, and he's actually speaking Spanish, which is cool. And one of the cells is one of the dead sailors. Ooh, it's a mannequin though, it's not moving, it's got glowing eyes, looks like it's kind of scary. But as you go further, you start to see more stuff. You go through a wine cellar, and there's like a drunken sailor there. What you do with a drunken sailor early in the morning? Most of those ships in those days, buggery, but that's another story. Anyway, you get past the wine casks and that sort of thing, and you go into the captain's quarters, except the captain's been, well, cut into quarters, or at least into halves. Part of them's hanging up with blood dripping down, the other part's still on the bed, blood everywhere. Ooh, it's quite nasty. Very gory, but beautiful, beautiful design of the bed and all the furniture and all the bits and pieces, candelabras and all the. It's magnificent. The props in this. It looks just like a real Spanish fort, and with the rooms you'd find as you go through there, treasure chests, all kinds of neat stuff. And of course soon the sailors themselves, with their desiccated flesh and the hideous glowing eyes, glowing bright green, made it difficult to see through those masks, I suppose, where the real eye holes were. But the eyes glue in the dark, so they come out of the shadows. You see the green eyes, all you see are the two green eyes, and then the sailor lurches forward and you see his whole hideous face. You know, like it's shadow, all you see are glowing eyes and a hideous face. Oh dear. And then there's the scene that was inspired from The Fog so much. You go into an actual chapel. And so you're in a little Spanish Catholic chapel with pictures of saints and things and flowers and little things, candles. And there in the chapel room you have the pews going up to the altar, except the altar is gone because the whole back of the thing is broken open. And and you can see the sea out there and the storm. And maybe in the very background the ship itself. Well, that's my imagination, I don't know. But there's rolling fog banks, and in that fog banks emerging in the projection are the sailors coming at you, just like in The Fog. Of course, it's not just a projection, because in front of that, amongst the pews, are the scare actors. So it gives that illusion of eternal depth. Quite spectacular, taken right out of The Fog. So that was that scene. And then, of course, you go into some more scenes where the sailors are killing the Spanish soldiers, hanging them up with the famous hanging man animatronic dummy that kicks its little feet as it's hanging. Remember, Julian Browning, you know, was one we saw before, and he's hanging above you, and you come through this area, and you go into. It's like going downstairs, but it's really a ramp because of wheelchairs, and then you're in this big, huge, elaborate scenario. It's like this would have been the facade, really, and it's the Spanish fort, and you're out in the courtyard of the fort, and you hear all the fort buildings, and they're enormous, and they go all the way up to the ceiling, and staircases going up, and there's sailors coming up and down them, some of them characters, some of them figures, and with their glowing eyes, and what's even more impressive is right in the middle of the courtyard, crashed into the side of the fort, is the ship itself, with the sails and everything, and there are sailors on the deck as well as below it, and it's a great big heaping pile of treasure on the deck, and it's all there. It's like, oh my god, quite spectacular. And then you go into, from that scene, you go into another corridor where you feel the cold wind blowing right at you. It's just right in your face, and there's water in it as well. It's like, oh my god, it's actually. And after that blusteriness, you're inside the ship. And here's a neat thing. You're in the hold of the ship, and they've tilted the room like this. It's on a bias, like you're a Batman villain in the 1960s. And you're on a bias when you walk that, and you have to walk like this. So it's, oh my god, because you're walking sideways, because the whole floor is tilted. Of course, for people in wheelchairs or disabled, aren't able to walk that way easily, there was a separate secret path to the side. It wasn't anywhere near as fun, because you're actually walking on part of the ship, below stairs in the hold, and in there there are hammocks, and the sailors are in them. Some of them are mannequins, some are live, and there's a hole in the one of those bung holes, whatever you call it, those holes that they go down into a lower level, and there's one down in there, and he comes popping out like a jack-in-the-box. And some are above you, and the hammocks reaching down, and it's all quite elaborate as you're walking down this. It's rather long. Of course, that scene was recreated last year in 25 Years of Monsters and Mayhem, but it didn't quite recapture the original, which seemed to be a bit bigger and more intense. At least in my memory it is, maybe not. because, you know, repeating it may lose something. But going through that, and after the end of it, you're not quite out of the house. You go through a couple more corridors where some pirates jump out at you, but there's also, you can see through a window, way off in the dark, these little teeny tiny green glowing eyes, like somebody's really far away. And as you have to walk up close before you turn, and as you come up to it, all of a sudden, comes right up to you because the guy's on a bungee, and so the pirate goes right up in your face before he swings back again. It's like, damn! He's like, whoa! Now he seems to be right up at you. It's quite shocking, and so that was the Forsaken. Now this, I've mentioned Chris Redfield more than once, and I've said it was sort of my duty in those days to protect you from him. So he was with me. Usually I was getting him drunk with blinky drinks, and Chris often and the reason I had to protect you, because Chris had a very bad habit of falling for these straight boys who only wanted to be friends with him for a bit, and then when they realized he wanted more than that, they would dump him, and then it would piss him off, and he was still obsessed with them. And a lot of them were scare actors sometimes, and then he would have to go into the house they were in over and over and over again, even though now he hated them, but he would still go back in that house over and over and over again. And there was one poor sailor who was the subject of his attention that year, and so we had to keep going through the Forsaken again and again and again and again. That happened, unfortunately. But one of the things Chris did that year with that, though, is making all sorts of really bad jokes, really off-colour jokes about the Forsaken. He would inevitably refer to the house as the Foreskin, because it was full of semen. Yeah, there's a reason I had to protect you from him. You see what I mean? I had to protect you. But because he was obsessed with it, as I alluded to in another video before, after the very last night, Halloween night, the very last Bill and Ted, there was actually just about a tiny fraction of time, and we were able to run like madmen all the way through past Men in Black, all the way down into what is today Springfield, but back then wasn't Springfield yet, to the International Food area, and then cut through Animal Actors, that little, and go back into Kids Zone, and run all the way back up to the queue for the Forsaken, where we were just able to squeeze in at the last second before they shut the thing down. And there was no one ahead of us and no one behind us. We were going in alone. And the two of us went through the house. And you know, that wasn't the first time we went through the house that night, like I said. We went many times, and that was the house I probably saw more than any other, because whenever I was with Chris, he wanted to do it 2 or 3 times a night usually. And so we went back through it one last time. We'd already been to the house about 2 or 3 times earlier that same Halloween night, as well as doing several other houses, but that was the one he was always wanting to do. So this was like our 4th time on that last night alone. And you know, the scare actors knew who we were. They'd seen us go through so many times. So when we came through and were on the very last run, the very last night, you know we got more attention, because here's these 2 guys who kept coming back over and over again. Now they're the last ones going through the house practically. And so going through the house was a better run than ever before, because they would totally get after us all the way through. But when I went through that one scene in the middle, that big courtyard, and there's that one pirate, not pirate, but seaman, sailor, by the ship itself, where there was a big chest full of treasure. And he stopped us and did something remarkable. And here I have to go get us something. I'll be right back. I'm not going long. I'm just going the other side of the room. Going over here to the other side of the room to get something I should have got before I started this whole thing. I should have brought it out before, but I'm pretty certain it's kept in this, kept in this thing I have over here on this shelf. Oh, there it is. Found it. No, that's not it. Sorry. That's something else. I know it's in there somewhere. Oh dear, I've brought the things on the floor now. Let me take this whole thing off the shelf. Let me take a look. I know it's in here somewhere, but it's covered up with all sorts of other... Oh, here it is. Got it. Alright. I'm back. Sorry about that. I thought it'd be quicker. Anyway, as I was saying, he stopped us, that sailor, and reached into the chest of jewels and handed something to Chris and handed something to me. And this is what he handed us. A pearl of rare price taken from the treasure of the Philippa Moniz itself. Whoa. A little bit of Halloween Horror Nights 21 I get to keep forever as my souvenir. Handed it to me. I don't know who that scare actor was, so he can't be fired. Of course, he can't be fired because he's no longer working for Halloween Horror Nights 21. And God knows if he ever got cast again. And we don't know who it is, it's just some sailor, but he handed me this so he can't get in trouble, so I can tell you about it. And he took this little pearl out and handed it to me on that very last night, on the very last run, just before closing on October 31st. It actually feels a little heavy. That's weird. Maybe it's a real pearl. I don't think so. But this was what he handed to me, and there it is. A pearl from the Forsaken. How lovely. Oh, it's got a hole in it. Like a bead, sort of. So, that was a little unusual souvenir that I got that year. Very last house, very last night. Quite fun. And for the Forsaken, of course, I also invented a lovely cocktail because I was doing that year. And let's see if I can find the Forsaken cocktail. Here it is. For the Forsaken, I wanted to make a cocktail that fits in with the idea of the high seas. I called it a loose cannon of a cocktail. It contained Captain Morgan's Malibu rum. So Captain Morgan's Malibu rum, orange and pineapple juice, a splash of grenadine for colour, and 151 floated on top. In some ways, it was a little bit like what the signature drink always was for Horror Nights, what you get in the Blinky Cup, except it didn't have any Monster Energy drink, but it had the different rums and juices and grenadine, but a little bit of 151 to make it stronger. And I said, there be squalls ahead, me hearties, are. Yes. And here it is. This was the Forsaken cocktail. As you see, it was also served in one of those Universal Studios plastic cups and garnished, as you can see, with a slice of orange and, even more appropriately, a sword through the orange. I said, don't just put a toothpick, have an actual sword if you have one, and he did. And so it was skewered with a saber, yes, a cutlass, yes, making it more appropriate to the house. And green too, the sword is, although the drink is orange. So that was the Forsaken cocktail. Alrighty then. So the next house then, we go from there to the houses in Sprung Tents, Sprung Tent 1 and 2. We start with number 1, the first Sprung Tent, and that was a rather nifty little house called the In-Between. Oh yes. Now, if you remember back in 2008, they had a house called Creatures, which featured horrific aliens, which you didn't see as well as you'd like to have. But in the backstory on the website, Mary Agana's patient, a young boy, had these nightmares and fears about alien creatures because he'd been reading about something quite similar in a comic book. The comic book was published by Ultra Violent Comics, Creatures, and the house was sort of his nightmare, the very comic book come to life. Well, it turns out the nice people at Art and Design, when creating original houses, sometimes they like to reuse stuff, and so they thought about that and thought this would be a sort of sequel to Creatures, not directly, but a sequel, sort of like, well, think about those movies that Edgar Wright makes with oh, what's his name, Simon Pegg and Nick Frost, you know, the Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and then The World's End. They're about 3 different things, 3 different sets of characters. They're not really sequels, but they're connected as a trilogy through a running joke about a cornetto. And so they call them the Cornetto trilogy. So there have been 3 houses now, that have no connection in plot or theme or anything, but are connected by a certain running joke or gag involving ultra-violent comics. The three ultra-violent, so I call those three houses the ultra-violent trilogy, even though I don't know if they call them that at Universal, but I've just sort of come up with that name because ultra-violent comics were featured in all three of them. This was the second one, and it was called The In-Between. And so the story of The In-Between comes from a 1950s EC Comics type of comic book called The In-Between. Yes, and in fact the facade for the house was the front cover of the comic book itself, which was rather nifty. And the idea of this, and I have heard, I don't know if it's true, that originally this was going to be an IP house based on a movie that was upcoming at that. It was originally upcoming called Ouija, about some kids mucking about with a Ouija board with some nasty consequences, except that movie went into turnaround and into production hell. And it was cancelled, they didn't make the movie, and therefore that they couldn't do the house. Now, several years later they did finally make that movie, and it turned out to be pretty much crap, so it's a good thing they didn't use it for the house, I guess. If, of course, the movie that was actually made resembled in any way what they were originally planning. But who cares? They came up with better ideas for the house. So the idea was, okay, college kids mucking about with the Ouija board, getting into trouble, only they decided to take it in a different direction. Instead of using an actual Hasbro Ouija board, they came up with a sort of ancient witch spirit board that is even older than Ouija, going back to whatever, a strange artifact perhaps from some other land or place, maybe Terra Quentis, who knows, looking all the creepy and satanic. And they stole it from one of their professors of religion. I happen to be a professor of religion. Don't steal our artifacts. Bad shit can happen to you. So they took this and they took it to their dorm one night, and I'm assuming after a few hits of the old bong and lots of natty ice, they were ready to play with it with dire consequences, but that'll have to be in part 11.